I know, lovely spring day, and I'm talking about death. But it was a big concern for people of the early church when they realized that people were dying in their numbers when they didn't think they were going to. In fact, a goodly number of Paul's letters to the early churches involved trying to answer the questions that were on the minds of early Christian believers. Like by this point, after Jesus' death and resurrection, when these letters were written, they were written before the Gospels, I think already. One of the matters that concerned them most was the death of loved ones as well as themselves. As a Pharisee, Paul had believed in an ultimate resurrection of those dead. It was a kind of a theological understanding. Since his conversion, his encounter with Christ on the Damascus Road, he could see that the resurrection had already begun with Christ's rising, and it became for him a truth more immediate. Paul's confidence in eternal life after death increased dramatically after that encounter. What had been a Pharisee's theological hope had become a fait accompli, the personal experience of the risen Jesus. Since God had raised Jesus from death, it made sense to Paul that Jesus would certainly raise all his people in due course. There were many early Christians at that time who had thought from something Jesus had said that they would never die before Christ's kingdom became a reality. So you can imagine the shock when people around them came to the end of their lives. What Jesus had really meant was that the kingdom of heaven would be started by his resurrection, which of course now had taken place. Based on that understanding, when people began to die in the early church, many couldn't understand why. They believed that death had been defeated. Surely that was what their baptism promised and taught. And so they questioned Paul about the meaning of death in their midst. To be really honest, is that not often our question as well? Whether it's the death of loved family members or the sudden death of friends at whatever age, we are perplexed by the reality of human limits. It shouldn't be that way. Someone made a design mistake. Paul's response was to tell those early believers not to lose heart. Even though our outer nature is wasting away, he wrote, our inner nature is being renewed day by day. See, Paul believed passionately that the power of death was totally vanquished because of Christ's resurrection. Now, Priscilla and Aquila are interesting people. They're very important in the New Testament. They had become close friends with Paul in Corinth, probably after they had been banished from Rome by the Emperor Claudius, sometime in the late 40s. All the Jews were kicked out. Priscilla and Aquila were tent makers, and likely, we think, lived and worked with Paul when they met in Corinth. Paul didn't just preach in the synagogue, or wherever he could. He earned a living during the week, and he did it by tent making. All three worked together. They were tent makers and likely lived together. So it's to that reality of tent making that Paul refers when he tries to respond to the questions about death from early Christians. From his own experience as a tent maker, he knew how a tent could wear out in time and cease to be a home. The seams stretched, the material failed, and was no longer able to keep out the weather. You're feeling at one with this, aren't you? The tent lost its shape. I feel at one with that. And failed to function as it was meant to. So it's to this image that Paul refers in order to explain the way in which the human body declines. Surely those of us who realize we're aging, some are in denial, understand I didn't point fingers. Understand that every day we ache and creak more and show signs of wearing out. The physical body just seems to run out of steam. But we believe with Paul that this outer covering, this body that we have, is not the full statement of who we are. So when we discard the body at some point, and we all will, it's our inner reality that continues eternally with God because of the result of Christ's sacrifice. We become one with Christ in his death and also in his resurrection. We know we have a building from God, Paul writes, a home not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. The real question for all of us is how we live in this hope. How do we keep heart when it feels as if death overcomes us and so many? I think I want to suggest to you that we need to live and breathe quite consciously the promise that Paul points us to based on our Christian hope in an eternal life with God. And it has to be more than just words for us. That means we cannot avoid considering the tentness of our lives. That is, the limitations we face as humans. But at the same time, we need to practice the promise for ourselves and those in our community. That is how faith works. Spent time with Al Williams on Friday, and you just have this strong sense, even though he's really on the last journey in many ways, just of how strong his faith is and how much his commitment to the church is. He believes in this hope. And it does change how he dies, I believe, as it should all of us. So we must not avoid reality, but engage it and see it in terms of God's provision for believers. That was Paul's understanding when he spoke to the early church. Now, this is not sick or bizarre for us to consciously be aware of our limitations. It's going to come to all of us. It needn't be a shock. So what does it mean? Well, one of the things I've been doing personally over the last few years is, actually once I turned 70, I got scared, is to practice reflection about aging. And I've written down and collected those reflections. In fact, they'll be published sometime this year. Just a small little book, but nevertheless. I want to share with you one entry in my journal of turning 70. It's called Dock Diving. And by sharing this, I want to tell you a bit about how active we must be in realizing where we really are. So, dock diving. The dock at our cottage is raised substantially over the water level later in the summer. Lake entry for swimming requires a leap or a dive, if you're up to that. For years, that was my favorite way to swim in the lake, starting with a majestic dive. As I perceived it, at least. It was always a moment when I assumed my young daughters and their cousins watched in wonder at my height-defying performance. Now I'm a little stiffer and feel it unnecessary to assault the sinuses with such a leap from on high. For me, it's a slower descent on the ladder from the dock. On it, I slip innocuously into the water, pausing to test the temperature and avoiding the shock of too fast an entry. On a recent weekend, I realized that the high-flying lake entry had become the purview of my son-in-law. Everything I used to do in this free, unabashed dive into the lake, he now does. And with that came an instant of reality for me that I may not have thought about before that moment. Life is moving forward and is in the process of moving on from me to another generation. At first realization, I found this quite anxiety-producing as I thought about the impact of what I was observing. As I reflected on it, however, and that's what I'm arguing for, is reflection, I came to feel more at peace. The appropriate revolving of the generations is well underway. How can I not feel good about that? My best hope is that my son-in-law will someday stand on the dock and watch his adult son, young Liam, diving into the lake from a great height. It is to that cycle of life that we are all committed. This is a verse from the Psalms. As for mortals, their days are like grass. They flourish like a flower of the field. For the wind passes over it, and it is gone, and its place knows it no more. But the steadfast love of the Lord is from everlasting to everlasting on those who fear him, and his righteousness to children's children, to those who keep his covenant and remember to do his commandments. So there's always a bittersweet sort of feeling to these reflections. There is the reality of who we are and who we are becoming, but there is also the inherent hope in us because of what we believe. And that's what Paul was trying to say to the Corinthians. We do not lose heart. There is an eternal home for each one of us. So are any of you concerned because of my words? Talking about death? Why would he be doing that in church? Terrible. Where else would you do it? Where else would you actually have faith that works? Faith is not something airy-fairy. It's got to be rooted in the real life and death of each of us. And it does change how we die. As I heard a little bird told me that each one of you is going to die, and how you die matters, because it will build the faith potentially of another generation, and on until God comes. Any comments, complaints? You're stunned. Yep.
I'm now 17 years older than my father when he died.
Oh, you're in big trouble.
To the point that no matter how much time I'm able to hold off the ravages of time,
Yep.
I'm going to consider it still not enough for the things I still want to do,
Yep.
places I still want to go, the books I still want to read, the plays I still want to see. There's a line in Christopher Marlowe's play, Dr. Faustus. And Faustus is bargaining with Mephistopheles over his soul. And he says to him, "Is it very far to hell?" And Mephistopheles says, "Why, this is hell, nor am I out of it." But I'm beginning to think that maybe this life is a lot more heaven than we realize. And we want to enjoy it a little more while we're here.
Yeah, there's an optimist for you. Glass half full. Thank you, Bruce. Well, Christians should be. You know, that's what we're about.
I find too that over the last 2 years, it's almost 2 years since I had diagnosed with stage 4 melanoma, and you realize that, even though you're only 63, that doesn't matter what the age is. You know, you could be 6, it doesn't matter. And you realize how precious life is, and you get a better awareness of people around you and things you want to do and how you want to live your life. My diagnosis is much better than it was if I had it 10 years ago. I wouldn't be sitting. 5 years ago, maybe. But with the immunotherapy, it has really extended my life. So I'm just,
Well, we're thankful for that.
yeah. And I get to share bathing suits.
That's an in-joke. Yes, sir.
Many people, I think, remember my wife. And I remember almost 5 years ago, just over 5 years ago, she was advised by the surgeon that she had cancer, pancreatic cancer.
Oh.
She had 3 months. The reply was, death is part of life.
Yeah. Death is part of life. Yeah, that's great wisdom. I think someone said that the extent to which you are prepared to die allows you to live better. That you see, I think that's part of the Christian pattern. When we know that death and eternal life are in the mix, it changes how we live, or it should. Even when our big lunk of a son-in-law dives into the lake better than we can anymore.
That's what I was talking about. I studied the book on Greek, and occasionally in my English program, I come across someone who's reading, and I have to try and add a bit to sort of supplement that. And I came across a Hebrew saying, which is, let us die when we are dead. It's, you have to think about it. Let us die when we are dead. It's very, very interesting.
How many people do we know that are alive but essentially dead in spirit? Yeah, that's not how we should be. It's not how Al Williams is sitting on the side of his bed, taking oxygen up his nose, and he's not dead. His heart is still turned toward God. That's how we all should be. Anyway, I offer you those thoughts, and my big question in life is whether there'll be coffee in heaven. So have a great week.
Oh, I'm talking about the wine, hey.
Well, they're both equally.
Yeah, you wouldn't want wine for breakfast.
Well, I can remember a great breakfast when I was a teacher when we had champagne and
Orange
Yeah,
juice.
mimosas.
ruined the day. Just totally ruined my day. Anyway, now next week I want you to think more about, it's Indigenous Sunday, a day of prayer, and that will be the focus of our time together. And we'll be focused in thinking about the life of the Indigenous in our land and what we can learn from them, and perhaps what we can do to help them as well. So that's next Sunday. Sunday after that, I'm gone. Yay. Well, that was pretty quiet. Don and I are going to Cole's ordination in Fredericton, really, in some ways, as your emissary. I think Stephen might too, I'm not sure. And the Reverend Mark Gladding will be taking the services that day. Mark was the regional dean in this area and just retired. And, priests never can retire. So he's happy to do a Sunday with you. I'm sure you'll treat him well. That's on the 27th, I guess. No, the 24th. The 24th.
We'd be with you in Fredericton.
Are you?
I said we would like.
Oh, right, yeah. Well, I hope the flood's gone. Anyway, blessings.